Welcome everyone to a Tuesday, which is very unusual for us, but we've shifted this time for the Easter holidays, and I appreciate the people who could also make this particular call for the AU Patient Summary FHIR IG. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country and that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all gather today, which for me is the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we acknowledge the First Peoples as the first scientists, educators and healers. In today's agenda, we're going through usual business, which we always do. And I promise to give an update and some information around the AU Patient Summary testing content. We've got some of the use case decision content coming from our previous meeting, and out of the Confluence page, the asynchronous kind of thing that was sent around for people to indicate their preferred consumer step, to go through that and also kind of elaborate on getting the direction for drafting that use cases. And then we're going to do a bit of a check-in, a bit on where we are now. It's the right time for a check-in. We're sort of quite a few months through what we'd originally proposed and set of activities and what's next. And if we get the time to do so, we might actually crack on to what's next and start reviewing some of the FHIR IG profiles in the Patient Summary FHIR IG in preparation for going to ballot for comment. But we'll have a look at all of that as we go and see if time permits. So I'll go through usual business. So as always, we start with approval of minutes. These were sent round for review last week. They have all the sort of attendees on here. We've got the YouTube link, our slides, we've got the decisions we made and what we talked about from the Connectathon review, and also the mentees we went through to talk about what would be the most useful characteristics for you, for the people who are implementing or are going to, in the short term to medium term, implement Patient Summary. What would be helpful to have as a use case characteristic in the FHIR IG. So we went through those, and what we didn't get time to do is then actually say, well, if these are the use case characteristics we want, which consumer journey step will we select? And so that's kind of what's on the agenda today, but this is the set of minutes from our last meeting. Now, does anyone need more time to review these before we look to approve them? All right, I'm not hearing anyone. So would someone like to motion approval of the minutes of our last meeting?
Make a motion, Landon Riley. For approval.
Thanks, Landon. Would anyone like to second?
Yeah, I can second. Steve Swinsberg.
Thanks, Steve. Are there any other comments or questions while I look to put out the poll? All right, I'll launch the electronic poll. So this is for approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. If you weren't there, you can absolutely click abstain. Please select affirmative if you're happy for the minutes of the meeting to be approved. And please select negative if you need more time to review or if there's something that you think needs to be changed in those minutes. We've got about 60% of participants, so still looking for people on the line. Now, if you've dialed in, you can say your name and what your vote is, because you won't be able to see the poll. And if you have, if I've made you co-host rights or there's some other reason you can't vote, you can either pop it in the chat or say your name and what your vote is, and we'll add that to the tally. All right, I'm going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end that poll. I will share the results. So with the vote in the chat, thank you, Steve, we have 11 affirmative, 0 negative, and 12 abstain. And so that motion carries. The minutes are passed. I'll stop sharing that poll and go back to the slides. All right. So minutes of last meeting are done. The actions out of the last meeting was that I had to send around an email to let people know about the Confluence page where you could indicate your preferred consumer journey step. That's happened. A number of people have indicated their consumer journey step, and I know a number of people weren't concerned. They were pretty happy with whatever step got chosen and so haven't voted. But either way, I've done that action, and we're going to talk about that shortly in the use case design decisions part of this meeting. And that's the only action out of the last meeting. In terms of updates and news, I wanted to go through that there is a AU Patient Summary Inferno test kit available. No, it's currently against the last snapshot. That's the one we took to the Connectathon, and it's at this location. That's a temporary location. It'll shift in the coming months, but if you're interested, I'll just go there. We'll get that to resolve. So what's available here is Inferno, which is really against servers, and it's an automated set of test suites that has a look at a number of things against dollar summary and against whether or not what you're producing from dollar summary is against allergy intolerance or condition or our kind of content, and also against doc rep. So this is very early, but this is starting to be built out. So this may be something of interest. There'll be more work to come, but here's where it is sitting now. All right, on to your patient summary testing. That was a good segue. And actually, sorry, before I move on, were there any other items to add to the agenda today? I'll just go back up to that. I forgot to ask while we were here. We have these things to go through, but is there anything that someone needs to add to this agenda to make sure we have time for? All right, I'm not hearing any. So let's go through to the patient summary FHIR IG testing. We've started doing this at the Connectathon. So a bit of a recap here. This is the kind of overall time frame that we have been looking at when we started this project, about what we're looking to achieve in terms of a first release of a patient summary FHIR IG, and looking at our timeframes, which you can see there's also AU Core on this because we are dependent on AU Core. I don't have IPS added, but if I had concrete timeframes from IPS, we would. And what we've been going through is having a set of development work with some intermediate snapshots. We take through a series of kind of testing events at different Connectathon. And you can also see now we've added the Spark testing event that's been scheduled in at the 24th of June. And then we're going to go out for a ballot for comment to the wider community, and then work through that, produce and test a snapshot, and then go out for ballot for working standard, work through any feedback for that and determine what it is that we need to change, if anything, before we release and publish a first release of the Australian Patient Summary FHIR IG for Australia. And in the context of this sort of overall time frame, our first opportunity to test some of the decisions that we've made, and we've made quite a lot, was the March Connectathon that we held in Sydney. And coming into this, we'd made the decisions around what are the priority sections, what will we have as support, and what will be our profile design principles around what does it look like if we are conformant to IPS and conformant to AU Core. And we had a baseline draft of an Australian patient summary with a full set of profiles to come into that Connectathon and test that out. And that was what was taken to the Connectathon. And we reported on some of the use cases in the last meeting, but I'll kind of go through a bit more around the testing itself in this session. So I don't think we need to go into too much more detail on why we do testing, but testing is pretty critical both in a HL7 sense for all its standards and approach, and it's also pretty critical for an accelerator to move beyond, I guess, an emergent sort of approach and to fast track something that we think is actually a proposed meaningful standard for Australia. Testing has to be undertaken through all the decisions that we make in these calls and we make out of ballot reconciliation to actually test and check and sense check that with a whole number of different systems. If that's actually working, if it's practical, if it's feasible, if it's working for the use cases that we are trying to support, if it works for a whole downstream and adaptable set of cases. And so testing is key throughout the entire kind of process. We do that both in events and out of events. Our first one's been a connectathon. There'll be a Spark testing event. And before we publish R1, I think there's 3 more connectathons scheduled that will take various baselines to test out some of what we've agreed, both the risky parts, the parts we're putting out. We may take some experimental baselines, and the things that we think are totally stable and expect are implemented widely, and we need to actually get the evidence that that is actually the case. So just quickly, there's inside and outside of events. The events that are coming up that I talked about there being the Sparked, oh, that says AU Core testing event. Apologies, I stole this slide from the AU Core slide pack. It's a combined testing event, so it's both for Patient Summary Core and e-requesting, is 24th of June. And then there's a number of connectathons coming up. There's one in August. There's one in, it's November or December. I'm not actually sure yet. That'll be up to HL7 and AU to announce. And there'll likely be one in March in 2026 because there's been one in March every year for quite a while now. And so in the testing events coming into those, there'll be a whole series of directions and pages if you're joining us on how to test, how can we get the results, how will all of that work. But it's also really important for testing outside of the events. If you're not able to make it, but you are actually looking at how does this work, pulling it down and comparing that against what you're trying to build, and you have some feedback, or you actually want to provide your test results to be recorded as part of the coverage of what's being tested in Patient Summary and be logged as a testing partner, then please email sparked@csiro.au for how you can be a testing partner for the Patient Summary FHIR IG outside of the testing events. I'm just going to quickly go, because this really leads into what I'm about to tell you. What happens to test results? So this is more about the standard itself and understanding what parts of the standard have been exercised and ensuring we're getting feedback about the standard and about its maturity and looking at what is actually being exchanged now. All the authors of Patient Summary device. Is no one doing a patient author? Do we have no evidence for that? Then it is about whether or not people have a complete production-ready system. That's not the point of this. The point of this is about assisting in development of an appropriate standard for Australia. So in terms of that, the test results and anything you submit in come to the Spark team and they're looked at for coverage and they get reported on for coverage. But the actual specific test data you're using, what passed or failed or any kind of insights into your product itself, those things aren't shared. They're destroyed after we do analysis and we check with you guys that that's actually what is covered. And that leads us to track a whole bunch of things. And we track different things depending on the standard. So for Patient Summary, at the moment, we've got a few things we're tracking that have come out of our previous meetings. So we've got the profiles, and those are all the profiles that are established in AU Patient Summary, and we are tracking which parts of these are being tested by different systems at different testing events. They may be for different use cases, And we'll have a look at what some of that looks like, but we're looking at things like which elements are being generated, what's being exchanged, what extensions are being used, who's using what terminology, are the missing data and the suppressed data requirements being looked at. And then we're also looking at the interactions. So coming into the Connectathon, we've done a series of meetings talking about the possible ways we could look at supporting the referral consumer journey. And that sort of culminated in talking through a set of potential interactions around bundle and document reference, being read, search, and create, and also looking at operations like dollar summary and dollar doc ref. And as part of those, there's also a bunch of different search parameters. You can do that when you're calling the operations on different endpoints, or when you're doing search. How are you searching is just as important as the fact that you're doing search. And then there's also this sort of ambiguous other. What is relevant? Can I ask you, because this is what we had tracked out at the last Connectathon, I'm about to report on it. Does anyone think something is missing from this? Did you expect that we would be tracking in terms of testing anything other than this at this point?
I think coming to business services.
All right. So here's what this looks like. Out of the Connectathon, there were 6 systems that were doing patient summary things. And of those 6 systems, unsurprisingly, 6 of them did bundle. Of course they did, because that's what a patient summary is. A patient summary is a bundle, has a composition. So there were 6 of those. We had 6 different systems testing patient. And what was then really interesting is that all 6 of them were testing condition, allergy intolerance, medication request, and immunization. And what this meant, of course, is that we had no empty sections being tested. So no sections where you'd say, I don't actually have that information for the patient. So that in and of itself is worth noting. It is something we will have to exercise in later kind of testing events, that we're seeking whether or not that is something that systems can handle or expect, because it's certainly supported by IPS. And at the moment, we support that in the Australian patient summary. But if that's not something that we have any evidence of people being able to handle, I think that comes into question. Other things I think that are worth noting with some of the authors, it's not actually strictly reported here, it's on the detailed results, and I'll show you about that. That there were a mix of different authoring types. We've got some evidence there of encounter and procedure. And then I guess coming over to interactions. So 4 different systems were making use of dollar summary, 2 were making use of dollar doc ref, and 1 was doing a bundle interaction. We were tracking composition interactions. I think that's a mistake looking through the notes. But no one was doing document reference interactions. So trying to retrieve or read or otherwise patient summaries using the document reference resource type. And in terms of gathering and reporting against AFMM2, or looking at some of our requirements coming into, do we have enough evidence to be confident in terms of a working standard? There's a long way to go, and that doesn't surprise me. I mean, this is our first testing event, and we're still going through and establishing, but this is the kind of thing that we're going to be tracking through as well. So here's who was at the Connectathon, and here's who was testing patient summary. It's these 6 folks. So we've got Beta Software, Best Practice, Innovise, MediRecords, Orion Health, and Tech Intro. We're connecting with each other and with other systems and having a look at their particular use cases. And that's what we've got the results from at this stage of the early AU patient summary. And there's a Conformance page for this. And I'm just popping that there. Now, from the point of the Connectathon onwards, we've got a page where we are going to continuously keep up to date both up to date with what events are coming and also up to date with who's testing what, whether that's inside events or outside of events, which elements are being exchanged, what interactions are happening, and also putting on the logos of the different testing partners who are joining us in demonstrating and testing patient summary content. And there's a bit of an FAQ and how to get involved. So if I go to this page, because there's a few things that I just want to call out. So here it is. We'll talk about the event in a moment, and we've got our testing partners. So this will always be kept up to date. When we have additional results come in, whether that's out of the June testing event, before it or after it, this will be updated, as will these overall numbers. And what we have are the detailed kind of testing spreadsheets here. This is where you would go if you want to know who's testing component.identifier, or sorry, composition.identifier. That's being tracked in here. So it's about coverage analysis in which systems, not about pass fail or all that kind of content. And then we're tracking across the different resources. And most importantly, for people on the line, here's where we want more. So out of allergy intolerance, we've got more than 3 systems. We're looking at and exchanging resources that had all the elements except for verification status, which was interesting. And I think that's a bit of a call out to the community to look at who's using verification status and why. There's certainly some more elements in composition we have to look at, some of which might come out of our use cases around attestation. And certainly we've got section empty reason there. And we've got basically this list continues. So if you are implementing or have implemented and you have these elements, we would really appreciate you getting in touch so that we could understand how that's being used and kind of track some of that through, because where we need to get to is what actually really is used. Richard?
I've got a question about the last column. Why is additional coverage desired? Some say evidence from no systems. Oh, no, look, I've worked it out. Don't worry, silly question. Where you've got evidence from 2 systems, the ones below it are the same because it's in the same block. And then evidence from 0 systems, the rest down in that block. And it changes, they change on the border, on the boundary from one element to the next one. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. And thank you for pointing that out. I hadn't pointed that out, but that is how to read the table. Yeah. So that's where we got to in the results. So that was a pretty good, I think, exercising of a whole number of kind of elements and where people are at the moment as we're starting this. We'll keep tracking this through and reporting them back out of all the events, as well as working with people outside of the events who are looking to implement to understand what is really needed. And where we've got requirements that are in AU Patient Summary, but they're actually not needed, then they shouldn't form part of the minimum requirements. That's also really important to understand. Here we go. So Sparked testing event. There's only one this year. We're holding that in Brisbane on the 24th of June. Registration's open for the next couple of weeks. So you've got about a fortnight to register for that event. If you can be in Brisbane on the 24th of June, whether that's for core patient summary e-requesting or a combination of those, please come join us. Come join us for the day to get in touch with other implementers, test out the current drafts of those 3 and how they're working in combination for different use cases, and get in touch with some of the other representatives who are there, including if you've got questions of the Sparked team or the agency potentially, and certainly other implementers who are hands-on implementing in the room. All right. So that's the end of the testing update. Are there any questions about the testing update before we move on to the use case design decisions? All right, I'll pass over to you, Shelley. Are you happy to share your screen?
Yeah, I can share my screen. That's fine. Hopefully everyone can see that okay.
Yes.
Fabulous. Okay, so just a quick recap for those who haven't been on the last couple of AU patient summary meetings. So what we've been focusing on is voting on those key characteristics that participants would like to see elaborated in the FHIR IG use cases. So as Danielle said, in our last meeting, we ran a Menti session to capture those preferences. And the goal was to make sure that we had use cases that are grounded in real world high value scenarios. So the ones that demonstrate clinical relevance, technical feasibility, and broad applicability. And so from that activity, we created a Confluence page, and I've put a link in the chat where we published a list of those top 10 characteristics, which we're using as a reference point for selecting and shaping our use cases. And then based on those characteristics, we proposed the 2 consumer journey steps that we believe best represent those as the examples that we want to develop in the FHIR IG. And we also provided a full list of the in-scope consumer journey steps, excluding any that are either clinical workflow only or that aren't relevant to the patient summary itself. And then finally, we asked participants to vote on their top 3 preferred journey steps to be elaborated into technical use cases. And then the outcome of that vote's what we're going to use to help inform our next steps in the IG development. And as Danielle mentioned, she emailed a link to that page out to all the participants. And we're going to have a look at the results in the following slide. So just a quick update on the voting that we opened via the Confluence page. So as of this morning, we received 8 responses. And of those, the top 2 preferences were actually the 2 consumer journey steps that we'd proposed. And those are step 4 of the referral to specialist and allied health and step 5 of the interstate GP visit. So what we'd like to do today in today's meeting is just take a moment to review those 2 proposed steps together and then just check with the group that they're happy for us to move forward with elaborating those into technical use cases. We're going to give everyone a chance to raise their concerns or suggest any alternatives, but otherwise we're hoping to confirm those 2 steps today so that we can proceed with going ahead and drafting those use cases for the FHIR IG as per that initial agreed approach. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's going to walk us through the 2 proposed use case steps and why we think they're a good fit. Steve, did you want me to keep sharing or would you prefer to take over the share?
Just keep sharing. That'd be great.
Yep,
And we'll
yep.
just walk through it. Yep. Thanks.
Sweet.
Awesome. Thanks. So so we have proposed 2 steps for elaboration into those technical use cases. And the ones that we've proposed, they demonstrate all of the characteristics that were voted on in that last meeting. And these steps are really where we think they fit best, those characteristics. So the first one is step 4 of the referral to specialist and allied health consumer journey. We're going to dive into some of the specific characteristics and a few assumptions in a moment. But overall, this step can demonstrate all of the top 10 key use case characteristics across the 2 patient summary documents that are actually involved in this step. So we've got a provider authored summary, but also a provider mediated access. And then we have a demonstration of currency via a device authored summary. This step can actually demonstrate a few other use case characteristics. So that includes versioning of the provided summary and access via the referral. So the next one. So likewise with this step demonstrates some of the other characteristics that people felt important to capture in our technical use case elaboration. So we've got access via some sort of RESTful API or link or QR code, the most recent version of a patient summary, and again, the access being mediated by a provider. So these are the 2 ones that we've proposed. I'd just like to open the floor for any discussion on those before we move forward. Pip?
Hi there. Look, I hope this is not too off topic. I was just curious to know, how would a patient access these summaries, or is that not what we're talking about at all? This is all purely internal, or would this interact with My Health Record or another patient portal?
Yeah, so we're not looking at patient access at the moment. This is more around some of the characteristics that people felt were important in deciding how to go forward in implementing patient summaries. So things like who's accessing it, and the most common one that people wanted demonstrated was a provider accessing it. So on behalf of the patient, whether or not the patient's sitting with them, or in terms of the interstate GP visit, the patient would be there, but then we've got the referral one where obviously the patient wouldn't be there. There's a couple of other use case consumer journeys, things like emergency visit. Again, patient is there but not conscious. And then there's another one around I think it's like a transfer of care. So there's not a lot of access by the patient in some of these patient summary journeys, but definitely that particular attribute is important, but we just feel like it's not as important based on the survey results, not as important just yet. It may come in a future version, more of that access by patient. Yeah. Does that answer?
Yeah,
the question?
there are some consumer journey steps that were the patient access. The framing is for the people who are implementing now. What's most useful for you when you're trying to implement right now? What are you trying to build? So let's make sure our discussions are focused around helping you implement the product you're trying to build and go to production over the next 6 months. And that was pretty clearly indicated that what they're trying to focus on now is making sure that it's provider accessing a certain, provider access. There absolutely are some of the use cases, and that's recognised about patient access, but it's more like, which one do we pick that will help people implement patient summary in the short term? And that's been, and that vote came through as provider. So we're like, right, let's pick a provider step.
But this particular step here is actually part of the patient journey that includes the patient themselves. So the patient is actually the carrier of this QR code. So there are some previous steps to this where potentially they could actually get access to the patient summary themselves, but that's not the one that we're focusing on. When we're looking at this particular step, we're more focused on the handover of that QR code by the patient so that the GP can actually retrieve that patient summary for patient care.
Yep.
Which also, just to background, we're talking about examples. The actual IG itself will absolutely support both. So the specification will support both. We're discussing now about elaborating on an example and the one that is most useful to people implementing now. And I guess a number of characteristics have been ranked, and that's kind of where that falls.
And there are examples internationally where they have implemented this kind of system where the patient themselves doesn't actually get access to the patient summary themselves. They're just the carrier of access to the patient summary by a clinician.
Yeah, if you'd like to, Shelley's just put a link into the Sparked website, which has the full set of consumer journey workflows. So as Heath mentioned, this is a step within a wider full journey where a whole bunch of other steps are happening. But we're just sort of narrowing in on specific steps, which demonstrate a few of the characteristics. So we can elaborate those and say, hey, this is how this particular situation might be handled in a technical way. Consent, yes. There's a question in the chat from Sanjeed. Consent out of scope. It is out of scope at the moment. That will likely come in a future version. Okay. Kevin has, yep, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Steve. Can I just ask for some clarification for this step as well as the other scenario? Like, does this one, for example, retrieval, does that imply the way in which this IPS is being generated or curated? So, you know how last week we did the Menti and we voted on the different sort of types, if it was, can't remember the exact wordings, but so this one is retrieval, and I guess does that have any relation to whether or not
To the
we
actual
are retrieving a curated summary, or are we a machine generated summary?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump into the deep dive into these steps in just a moment. But yeah, there are a couple of assumptions made, and a few things where it could be maybe the GP has used different sources, maybe not. It's not evident from this particular step. In the previous steps in this particular journey, it does mention things about the provider, sorry, the GP creating the patient summary. So this particular step will have a few assumptions with it, which will be, I guess, open to interpretation.
Can we bring in, I think, just to set the scene for people, those top 10? I don't know if that was shown. So whatever is proposed was this dual top 10. That might be on the Confluence page, which would answer Kevin's question about.
It is, yeah.
That's not. Can you click on the Confluence, because it actually lists the numbers from 1 to 10 of what those are.
Yeah.
There.
Okay.
Yeah, if we can make that
there.
bigger. So there you go. That's the patient summary authored by a provider where it's curated from a single source system. So based on, like you said, what we indicated would be most useful right now, that's what we should be selecting steps to elaborate into.
Yeah, this particular step, though, doesn't say some of those words. But we would assume that we're going to make the assumption that the data is curated from a specific single source. Yeah.
Well, I
And that's
interpret
the intention.
slightly different that it's basically agnostic. We're just talking about retrieval. We're agnostic on how it actually got created. It might have been auto-generated. It might have been curated. We don't actually care in this particular step. It's like all we're focusing on is how to actually get it through these mediation steps.
Yep.
Cool, thanks.
Cool. All right, if there's no other questions, we'll move on to the next slide, please, Shelley. Yep, okay. So I guess based on those results, these are the top two that were indicated as preferences. So I'd like to motion that we accept step 4 of the referral to specialist and allied health consumer journey, and step 5 of the interstate GP visit consumer journey for elaboration into our technical use cases.
Under the premise that the useful characteristics that were selected in the previous meeting will be applied across these two. Yep. Okay, so that's the motion. Is there someone who would like to second that motion?
I would.
Okay, thanks, Sanjeev. Are there any other comments or questions before we move to the poll? All right, I'm about to put up the poll for the current motion, which is that we select these two consumer journeys to elaborate into technical use cases that will demonstrate the characteristics of the use cases we voted on in the previous meeting. We've got about 50% of participants, so we're waiting for more people to select affirmative, negative, or abstain. If you can't vote but have access to the chat, pop your vote in the chat. If you've dialed in, you can say your name and what your vote is, affirmative, negative, or abstain, and we'll add that into the totals. We've got 80%. I'm now going to count down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end that poll and I'll share the results. So including the one in the chat, we have 21 affirmative, 0 negative, and 8 abstain. So the motion carries, and we will take those 2 forwards. Thank you.
Great. So let's dive into these a little bit further. So as we mentioned, the characteristics, I've actually listed the 10 characteristics there in a summary from that Conformance page. So this use case, this step does demonstrate all those. So if we're going through the text, so where the endocrinologist accesses the patient summary, that is our access mediated by a provider. We have a RESTful API. We're making that as an assumption. I might just get to these assumptions separately. The patient summary being embedded in the referral. So we're going to say that that is authored by a provider, which would be the GP that made the referral, where the data is curated from a single source system. Where the patient summary is embedded in the referral, again, that's attested to by that provider. The words of most recent patient summary, so that will be authored by a device, which will be machine generated. So where the data is retrieved from a single source system. The most recent or the embedded patient summary, that demonstrates the mix of the latest and historical versions that are available. Again, the most recent patient summary will be the most recent version within a single system. And the device authored digital signature will be the characteristic that is the patient summary is attested to by a digital signature. So those are the 10 characteristics that were voted on. And so you can see that from the specific text in that use case step that each of those are demonstrated. There's a couple of assumptions. So the first one is that the most recent patient summary is device authored. So we're going to assume that. We can discuss that in a moment. We're also going to assume that there's some sort of link or QR code or RESTful API to access the patient summary. And the final assumption, which is the last sentence in that use case step, is that the dose increase to insulin, that will obviously get recorded in their system, but we're not considering that to be an update to the patient summary for release 1. So that's just something has happened along the way, but it's out of scope for any sort of update to the patient summary. So what we're intending on doing is then taking each of those characteristics and assumptions and building out the sequence diagrams and a bit of narrative around what's happening here. And that will be what we come back with. Any questions or feedback on any of that at the moment? Sanjeev?
Yeah, question around one of the characteristics, mix of links and historical versions available.
Yep.
Is that
okay?
Yep, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can talk to that. So mix of latest. So that will be where you have the patient summary embedded in the referral, which may have been made a week ago, or however long it takes to actually receive, to start acting on the referral. But then you've also got, so that'll be the historical version, I guess. And then you've got the most recent patient summary. So in this situation, the endocrinologist is looking at the referral one, and then also the most recent one, and just checking that everything's up to date.
So question is, is this a suggestion, or it's how we are looking at implementing it?
I think, Sanjeev, and I'll double check this with Steve, I think because that could be taken as both a technical sense, right? Where you're trying to present that. But I think actually in this case, it's actually just meant in terms of a workflow sense. Like the particular practitioner has available to them both a historical version, which is the one embedded in the referral, but also has available to them a later one. I think that's what that's meant. Is that right, Steve? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So they've got 2 available that they can look at. Yeah.
But just looking at it from an implementation perspective, if you're embedding a link, then we are looking at storing every version of patient summary somewhere. most probably in a vendor system, which can be accessed either via the referral or the latest one can be requested.
Kind of, because I mean, basically the fundamentals of this particular user story or this particular step in this particular journey, you're attaching in some form a patient summary to a specific referral letter on a particular day, and that's what has to be retrieved. But as well as they want to be able to get access to the most recent as well. So it's not necessarily always, it's if in the context of a referral, you should be doing that.
Now, before we go to Kathleen, I want to double check here. I think the inherent assumption about that is actually that the most recent is coming from a different system. Is that right? Like, is that like more where that might be something that comes from the My Health record, or there's an assumption there's a HIE or something at play there that's why there's some sort of other thing that we're going, oh, it's available from somewhere else? Or at least that's, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so that's where the device authoring comes in. So you'd be saying, right, give me the most recent, and wherever that comes from, let's say it's My Health record, that's going to be building that patient summary and returning it. Yeah.
It could be from the GP as well.
Yeah, it could be from anywhere.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I was just going to say the two could actually be the same depending on if anything's changed or not. But you have to put the information of the summary that comes with the referral because that becomes part of the referral. And then you need to have the ability to look at the most recent, just purely because if there's any delay or any change, some of these referrals could take 6 months before they're seen, or it could be 2 days. So you need that option.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think that was a really good description of why this was a good step to pick, about how it gives us options to demonstrate different kinds of things that might happen with examples that are relevant to people who are trying to build now. And
I think that was Kathleen's point on why this characteristic even existed when we voted on it last time. It was number 6, and on the top of the list there, those key use case characteristics on the Conformance page.
Yeah. Can I come back to Sanjeet to ask, has that answered your question? Is there anything else that you want to dig into a bit more on that topic?
It is answered just from a vendor perspective. I mean, I was thinking what extra stuff we have to do. It's not just retrieval or generation now. We have to store also. So we have to look at that as well.
Well, maybe you do and maybe you don't. Part of the embedded in the referral is it might actually go to a particular version of something in a particular system. I mean, I suppose that's probably the next step, is to go, well, what does it mean to, what example are we showing? Because let's be clear again, these are examples, not mandates. What example do we want to put in the patient summary IG about how an endocrinologist can access the patient summary embedded in the referral? And yeah,
it depends how we implement it. We don't know what the solution is yet. So you may not, or the solution might actually have that capability built into it.
Okay. Should we move on to the next one? Yep. Great. Okay. So diving into this one now. So the interstate GP visit, step 5, where the patient summary is being retrieved. So we've got a couple of characteristics being demonstrated here. So where the access is being mediated by a provider. So again, that's our top voted characteristic, and that's where the GP retrieves Jeremy's patient summary, which is the wording in that step there. We've got another one, which is that the patient summary is attested to by a provider at the time of creation. So again, this is where the GP is retrieving the patient summary, and it's from his usual GP. So the GP has curated or created some sort of patient summary that can be retrieved. And then the other characteristic is that it's the most recent version within a single system, because it says there that it's the up-to-date patient summary. There are a couple of embedded assumptions again here. So the that the patient summary is provided by a RESTful API or a link or a QR code. There are assumptions, again, for accessing the patient summary. So similar to the last step in terms of some of the assumptions, but it's a good cross-section. Both of these are a good cross-section across all of those different characteristics. So any questions or feedback on any of those?
I think I have one point. In terms of characteristics on the right, it says both access via a link and then below access via a QR code. That seems to me to be more options rather than both. Is that the case?
Personally, I agree with that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how a single retrieval is going to be both of those things.
Well, a QR code is really just a rendering of a link.
True, but I assumed since we had been kind of talking about them as separate things that we were talking about the QR code variation of a link and then some non-QR code link.
Yeah, and that's what I meant. I thought what you meant by the option. It could be presented as a link. It could be presented as a QR code. But
yeah, so
ultimately,
I think
it comes back to a retrieval. However, it's kind of rendered as a link or a QR.
Yeah, so I think that's my point. That on the right, I guess I was confused by having both those bullet points.
Oh, they were just to represent the characteristics that were voted on. So that each of these could be demonstrated. So yeah, maybe a QR code, maybe a link. Either way.
Neil?
So, going back to Sanjeet's question, if the link was implemented as a smart health link, this smart health link take care of the of that version of the patient summary at that point of time, or would the EMR still need to persist it in their system?
Heath, do you want to field that one?
I can, but I'm just wondering whether we want to get into implementation details at the moment.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've got 5 more minutes to talk about potential, well, probably 4 minutes on this topic before we go to next things. And I think this is the kind of conversation I'm assuming we will continue to have, which is about saying, what's the example we want to show? So I think Neil's question is relevant towards what example we would want to put in the IG.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So just repeat the question then, if I've got
I'm returning
permission
back
to respond.
Coming back to Sanjeet's question about previous versions, if the link is implemented as a smart health link, just want to clarify, does smart health link take care of saving that particular version of the patient summary, or is persistence still done by the EMR in that scenario?
Okay, so the quick answer to the question is that it can. So to elaborate on that, basically a smart health link can be static, as in it points to the same thing forever, as long as the link is valid, or it can actually be dynamic. So it can actually, what you get back each time you execute the link is different. So it actually supports, if we go back to the previous one, it actually supports both a particular version at a point in time, as well as something that is the latest, because the link is actually specifically to something that is the latest versus something that is specifically to an individual version at a point in time. And just one final comment as well, just I guess to address Sanjeet's concern, it can actually store the patient summary external to any particular API or server where the patient summary was created as well, because effectively it is just a file in the end, whether it's statically stored or dynamically generated through an API. I hope I haven't confused the situation.
Thanks.
Good points about probably leading us on to what's next. Are there any other comments or questions on this point before I think, and I do need to call time here of a couple more minutes on this before we need to move on to other topics and hold any further use case content to our next meeting? All right, let's wrap that up, Shelley, Steve.
Yep. Okay, so back to you, Shelley.
Yep. So now that we've reached consensus on the 2 highest priority steps, it's time to roll up our sleeves and bring them to life. So for our next meeting, what we're going to do is we're going to start expanding and elaborating on each of those selected steps. As per our initial agreed approach, we're going to go away and start drafting those proposed initial inclusions for the use cases. So this is going to include things like a draft plain English description that captures the clinical or real world context, essentially telling the story of what's happening in that step. And then we're going to complement that with a draft narrative flow, along with either a UML diagram or a sequence diagram, just to help visualize how the step unfolds across systems and stakeholders. And then at our next meeting, we're also going to facilitate a discussion around the nuts and the bolts. So what are the system actions involved? Things like query, render, notify, and then also what are the relevant FHIR interactions? So for example, we'll use something like $summary operation. The aim here is just to take these abstract steps and really start to give them some structure, clarity, and momentum. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Danielle. Do you want me to keep sharing, or would you prefer me to hand the share back to you?
No, I think hand the share. It's 30 minutes, and I think 30 minutes of someone listening to next slide. It might be a bit long. How's that? Can people see my screen now?
No. Oh, yep.
Yep.
Beautiful. Righto. So this is a bit of the check-in I was talking about, the next things we have to do. And if we do get time, we'll kick it off now. Otherwise, it'll be next meeting where we're going to really start to go through the detail of our FHIR IG. Yeah, I'm bringing back this slide again because this is our overall time frame and what we're looking at. Leading through to publication of the standard in sort of end of June, beginning of July next year. And there's a whole bunch of opportunities for testing. We've done one. There'll be a bit more in the testing event. These are the events that are there. They've got scheduled for connectathons. There's a March one. So the only testing event from Sparked is the June one at the moment. And then there's also testing outside of any of those events that we'll talk about a bit more, but I absolutely encourage people who either can't make it, who are maybe international, who have some feedback, especially on your platforms, if they're multinational platforms, to provide some feedback into where and how Australia's patient summary is going. So where are we? Across the development approach for the first release of Australian Patient Summary, we're kind of in month 6 at the moment, which is to say we're coming up to a ballot for comment, which is the end, really the milestone of our initial development period, where we're pulling together all sorts of ideas. What are we going to work on? What's our scope? Are we kind of happy with this? Doing a bit of early testing. And then pulling together a draft to go out for a particular ballot for comment. And so far, we've formed our project team. We have agreed on our priorities. We've developed our early draft profiles. We've already tested at a connectathon and are now starting to elaborate on some of the use cases and guidance. But there's some more things to do there before we do a ballot for comment. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. And then we go through more of a refinement focus. At the moment, that's called Steward Validation Pilot. But what that's about is taking the wider community feedback, that sort of sense checking on where we are and where we're going, feedback through a whole bunch of testing events, before we essentially propose a working standard for Australia. And that's what the ballot is. That ballot that we put out for first release is our proposal, and by our, I mean this group, this call, the series of participants are putting out a proposed working standard for Australia to review and either endorse or tell us what they think needs to change before we can establish a working standard, which is then that ballot reconciliation process, we go through to publication. And so with that process in mind, I'm just going to quick run through balloting, because not everyone has gone through a HL7AU ballot before. That there are a couple of steps that we take where balloting is the formal process from HL7, both HL7 Australia and international, and it's the means by which they use to get feedback and also by which you get authorization in order to actually publish a formal release of a standard. There's all sorts of rules, and as we get closer to balloting, we'll talk about them. I just wanted to be clear that this is a HL7 process. It's part of what every FHIR standard, NV2 standard, and CDA standard goes through. And there's different levels for balloting, and that defines what they do and then what the results can be used for. Of all the different levels, which is for comment, there's informative, there's what we call in Australia working standard, which is known internationally as standard for trial use, and there's normative. For the purpose of our first release, we care about for comment and we care about working standards. They're the two things that will take us through to establishing an initial release of an Australian Patient Summary FHIR IG. So ballot for comment. What this does is it's a way for us to, earlier in the development cycle, go out for a formal feedback cycle to the community. And this gives us the guidance and direction from the wider community, and that includes international. A whole bunch of international folks will review this because, of course, we sit within an international context, to get the feedback on where are we going, have we done enough, is this appropriate, where are we going too far, what are we missing. This isn't about actually publishing a standard at this point. This is for comment. There's no pass or fail here. This is where we are really trying to solicit review from people that will guide us through to what that first release should be. So for us, what that means is we should be providing to the community what is an initial baseline. And an initial kind of baseline that we agreed on was to be this foundational baseline we can evolve on. And that will be made up of a draft set of minimum expectations for patient summaries in Australia, which will include the principles we'd already agreed around things like being compliant to IPS and being compliant to AU Core. And there are a whole number of other things we've discussed that we've agreed set our minimum expectations. And we're going to put that out, and we will ask feedback for the community on our work, on what we think are those minimum expectations through that process. And so that's going to consist of basically the following things: a set of profiles, and those profiles, like AU patient summary bundle and composition and patient, might be at either draft 0 or AFMM1 maturity levels. Either is fine. There needs to be a set of conformance expectations. We've been saying this, that in order to implement Australian Patient Summary, we're going to be compliant to IPS and compliant to AU Core. We need to answer, what does that mean? What does compliance to Australian Patient Summary actually mean? We're looking to include an example use case, at least one, maybe more. We're looking to include, at least for consideration, some sort of draft around where we're going with security and privacy considerations, some mapping back to the clinical data model, that work that we've been doing that has guided our scope and our consumer journeys from our AU CDI, and that came out for review in the patient summary component, and also formally establishing the relationship between IPS and AU Core. They're kind of the things that we need to set in place. Some of these are rules from HL7AU, some of these are rules from the FHIR standard, and some of these are just the things we actually agreed on when we got together and said, here's what we're going to do in R1 in order to get some meaningful feedback from the community. Now, the ballot for comment is going to be in mid-August to mid-September. I don't know the exact dates. I've got some guesses that it's probably actually like 11th of August through to 9th of September, based on previous years. but HL7AU will need to announce when the ballot is for us, but it'll be in that period of time. And I'm also just going to highlight what is a ballot for working standard, just to show the difference between this is for comment and that serves a purpose for us. And when we go out to at the end, when we've worked through that, we've got the feedback from the community, we've evaluated that, we've done a whole bunch of testing exercises, and we're pretty happy that what we've built is a meaningful proposed working standard for Australia. We're going to go out for a ballot for working standard. Now, this one is actually where we're putting this out to the community and going, here's our proposal. We actually think this is ready to implement, as in it's actually ready to exercise and evolve this. It's not locked down, it's not normative, but this is something that is production ready. You can start to build to this and start to claim conformance to this. And this also, through this process, authorizes, if you pass ballot, to publish a formal release of the standard and go, here it is, this is the Australian Patient Summary for Australia. In this one, there's a little bit of a difference about the maturity levels, where it can't just be draft 0 anymore. It has to be at least AFMM1. If we get time, I'll just cover that at the moment, or actually coming up. Otherwise, we'll talk about it later. But by the time we go to publication, we want to be at the maturity level of AFMM2. AFMM stands for Australian FHIR Maturity Model. So they're different levels from 0 through to 5. So that's what the two ballots that are kind of our big milestones for our project that are coming through. Next slide was on the AFMM levels. And I've only brought in 0, 1, and 2 because they're really all that's relevant for us working through a release. If you want to look at the full set of what does it mean to go from draft 0 right through to a maturity level of 5, I think, Dushi, you might have popped the definitions or the location on where to find them in the chat. That would be great if you can. But essentially, thanks, Dushi. Essentially, draft 0 is we have something. There's a draft there. AFMM1 is where we've actually started to work through that content, talk about it, go through a formal process. And AFMM2 means we've actually got some testing and some results there. And so if we apply this to where we are, we're at draft 0. We initially set a whole set of principles around how we would draft this. We've gone away and we've built that. And so we have a draft set of artifacts. These are published. They are in a current build of the Australian Patient Summary FHIR IG. So these are draft set of profiles. Where we want to get to around ballot for comment is this one. We want to be at level 1. Level 1 is you have an artifact, which is our profiles. And it also has no warnings or errors. So that's a QA type thing. Like you've actually technically authored it correctly. If we find there are still some warning or errors thrown through the automated build process, we'll bring those back to this group to talk them through about why these might be tooling issues or something else that means that they need to be accepted essentially as a waiver, as this isn't actually a problem with the artifact. There's some other source of the issue there that is triggering some kind of warning or error. And most importantly, we need to have considered this profile. And from our perspective, for the context we're going to use this in, indicate we think that this is actually substantially complete and ready for implementation. So we need to look at things like the AU Patient Summary patient profile that we have a set of principles about and actually go through and consider, is this complete? Are we happy with this now to go forwards with? Is this ready for implementation? Are there any outstanding things that we really need to work through before this can actually be looked at further? We're going to do that through a series of activities. We're going to do a series of profile walkthroughs in these FHIR IG calls, starting, well, maybe not today because we don't have time, but absolutely next week. There'll be the Spark testing event where we're starting to look at these profiles. The ballot for comment in and of itself will be a means from which we will get feedback from the community about the draft profiles as to whether or not there are any outstanding things from the wider community's perspective. And there'll be a connectathon in this process. For AFMM2, which is where we need to be for everything in order to publish as a working standard, this is that we've reviewed it as a working group and we are saying, yes, this artifact is indeed substantially complete and ready for implementation. It's technically authored correctly. But in addition to that, we've actually gone out and we have evidence of this being tested that successfully supports interoperability among at least 3 independently developed systems. And it also has to have leveraged most of the scope. So that's 80% of those core data elements using appropriate data scenarios. We've got a few of those on the declared scopes, and we're going to go through and look at this through a few things. One of those will be connectathons, any testing and feedback that happens outside of the events, and the ballot for working standard itself. We may have evidence for some of these profiles prior to going to ballot for working standard to say, well, we think these already meet the criteria. But others, we may, through the ballot for working standard process, wait for that feedback before we consider that we can be confident that they meet that criteria. So that's part of what we need to go through. And in terms of weighting, if we just looked at standard results now around where do we have results out of the 6 systems that have tested, we've got successful testing evidence of a whole bunch of things here, at least from bundle, condition and allergy intolerance. But this is too early. We haven't actually got to AFMM1 yet, where we, as through a series of calls, have said we've evaluated this and we're comfortable. So it's too early for us to be making any sort of declaration of AFMM2. So we're going to cycle back to this, but keep tracking through the results this whole time of who is testing what. This is another view. This is more of the detailed process and where we are as we're moving into, AFMM1. And we've got those milestones, but I'm going to move past this one pretty quickly, looking at time, and go here. So this is essentially our scope. If we put together our scope that we agreed on back in our scoping workshops, and we did the walkthrough of all the different pages that we need to have in the FHIR IG, this is where this sort of comes to at the moment for R1. This is what we're looking at. If I start on the left, and folks, if anytime you want to ask a question or you want to propose something, please pop your hand up, no props. So on the left, we've been talking through different interactions and where we seem to be going, and I think that's quite a respectable position for R1, is that we're looking at how the different operations and interactions that are available through the FHIR standard or IPS, like dollar summary, could be used within Australia, but that we're not, I think, going to land on looking to mandate these at this time. That's looking like that's much more of a national kind of HIE perspective in sort of R2, but that will likely have a set of guidance on what are the kinds of approaches that people are using and some useful information on how to use those in Australia. So that's why that's got that sort of transparent X across this, that we're probably not going to mandate any capability statements and actor definition, but we're probably going to be having a series of guidance that we'll talk through in these calls that will come out of what people are actually building. In terms of the profiles, this is the set of profiles that we have agreed on, and that hasn't shifted at this point. No one's asked for any new ones. And I don't really expect to see any new ones, but we might find that out through ballot. And for every profile, there's also required pages for profiles. Like there's a profile page that needs to come in. The other content on the right are the other things that make up a FHIR IG. And we walked through pretty much all of these when I did that walkthrough back in, I think it was February 7th, maybe, in our call on what is in the Patient Summary FHIR IG, where we will have to have an AU variant statement page because of HL7AU requirements. We must always, for every single FHIR IG, be explicit on our security and privacy considerations. Even if we don't have any, we need to be clear about that. We must have conformance requirements in our FHIR IG, or be clear about where we land on that. We need to have our mapping to AU-CDI. We need to talk about our relationship to AU Core and IPS. There's a whole bunch of surrounding pages, like their support pages that are in every HL7AU IG and a home page and all sorts of stuff. We have to have a sex and gender page, which describes what sex and gender concepts are in this IG. We did a quick walkthrough of that in February. And then there's these other ones that are in yellow, because leaning off the IPS colors where blue is required, these yellow ones are the nice to haves. It's guidance, the use case, we're working on use cases, and having a comparison page where we compare what we're doing to like IPA, IPS, or other things. We would like to have those, but they're not actually a mandatory requirement. So this is kind of looking at our R1 scope. If we narrow in a bit more about the ballot for comment scope, here's where I think we need to land. We need to have drafts of all our profiles that we have considered and that we understand the baseline we're putting forwards for community feedback around those minimum expectations for FHIR resources. So those need to be in. And every time you have a profile, you need the HL7AU pages. And I think we should also be aiming to have drafts of the following pages and content on the right. Because those things are mandatory, we really should be working towards having an initial proposal or things we're at least putting to the community for feedback on the direction we're going for ballot for comment. Even if they're not the final, that's fine. We can put something out for ballot for comment. We should really be aiming for that. And I really think we should be aiming to have the use case in that as well. Does that make sense to people around what we're thinking we need to have in a ballot for comment kind of draft and have worked through in these calls? I'm going to go with yes. So let's move on to overlays.
I was going to say very, very good, Danielle. Oops, Craig.
Okay. Let's talk about status of where we are. So no fear, it looks like a lot, but hey, we've actually accomplished a lot. We're several months in. We actually have all these drafts of the profiles ready for inspection. That's the little inspection icon, by the way, guys, where we're like looking in the magnifying glass for, are we finding bugs? Oops. Are we giving it a tick? So that's all
It looks
ready for
like
us to
we've
go.
found approved bugs.
Sure. Well, maybe we will. Maybe we'll find a thing and say, you know what? Let's put that out for ballot for comment. But it's ready for us to look closer. So we can do that straight away. And we'll start doing that, I think, in the next calls. Go through all of these. We're also ready to go with this variant statement page. We've got something in security and privacy, and I think we need to look at it and see if we're happy with where that's at, or if there's anything we need to do before we go out for ballot for comment. And the sex and gender page is there. So that's what's ready for us to actually have a look at and start going through that more detailed walkthrough and check for bugs, check for changes, check if we are totally satisfied. What's under construction now? We've been going through the use case decisions. So the use case under construction. The rest of the required HL7AU pages, like having a home page that's up to date for the FHIR IG, they're under construction. I'm not proposing we look at those in detail, probably just before it goes out for ballot for comment. We'll do a quick check through, but I mean, that's a bit boring. They're what's under construction. This one, this is big. It's a small blue small blue rectangle. It is a big, big thing for us to discuss and get to a set of agreements on what does it mean to conform to Australian Patient Summary, that in and of itself means that you conform to IPS and conform to AU4. So we really need to start working through that. And let's have a look at what that means, our set of activities. So for the ballot for comment, where we want to get to, we've got to do a set of things. There's the walkthrough of the profiles. Let's run through those in these calls and check through them. Is anything that's in there going to be a problem to implement in Australia? Because at the moment, remember, the baseline is just literally this profile complies to core and IPS. It has nothing extra in it. So we need to review what's missing. It has nothing extra. Is there something in Australia we should be proposing so that we have that in the ballot for comment? Is there anything that we're inheriting either from core or from IPS that's actually a problem? Because we need to provide that feedback back to them ASAP so that IPS can either consider whether or not to remove, or AU core can consider whether or not to relax or remove. So we need to go through those. We need to somehow get to a proposal for conformance requirements, do that kind of walkthrough of the security and privacy page. I think the mappings is a lot easier. We inherit those largely from AU core. That's probably relatively simple, but we need to confirm those mappings and where we're at and make sure we're happy with what's going out to ballot for comment. Look through those other pages like gender and variance. Check where we're at with AFMM. Is anything we're happy to move to level 1? That'll probably fall out of that first pass walkthrough on where we go. Look, this is really solid. We can't see any change. We're happy to say that, in our opinion, this meets the requirements for AFMM1. That will fall out of that process. We're going to be doing some testing of the current baseline, and we're going to be working through the use case. This is what we need to do in May and July. So it's a bit of stuff. Here's the profiles. We've got 15 at the moment, and we should walk through these in our calls, basically. And at the same time, we'll go through, do a walk through the profile, and we'll also check through the backlog, remembering the JIRA project is out, and if there have been any JIRAs raised on those particular profiles, we'll go through those at the time. Probably skip past this, but I'm just going to say that this is the kind of thing we need to do. We don't have that many meetings before the testing event, but it'd be good to get quite a bit, as much as we can, before the testing event, so that we're testing on the updated baseline if we do decide to make any changes. And then we've got 6 meetings to get through all those profiles before we go to ballot for comment. So it is a little bit squishy. Then we've got conformance. Heath, do you want to speak to this one?
Sure can. So Danielle sort of mentioned along the way, but we really need to understand what it means and document in the IG. What does it mean from a vendor to state compliance to the AU Patient Summary IG? So we're looking at 2 areas around what are the rules for data conformance, and I guess profiles are what we're talking about there. What are our data models, and think basic things around cardinalities and value sets and those sorts of things. But then also there is this idea of must support, and what does that mean? So we have had in the past, in the context of AU core, some considerable discussions around what does must support mean in AU core. But now that we're moving this into Patient Summary, and we are trying to align with Patient Summary, AU core, but at the same time, we're aligning with IPS. So we need to understand what IPS means by must support, and try and come to our conclusion around what does must support mean for AU Patient Summary. We also have conformance around how do we actually obtain patient summaries, exchanging them, persisting them, etc. So there's these interaction and effectively APIs. And Daniel sort of talked about, well, we're probably not going to get that, but at least we'll start having some conversations around what does it mean from a conformance perspective, and what does it mean if we don't have these conformance statements. So we're running out of time, so I'll skip through the rest. But as I said, how does patient summary relate to international patient summary? How are we going to actually represent that in the IG? And then how do we actually meaningfully implement an AU patient summary and actually state conformance, etc. So the sessions that we're going to be looking at doing as a separate call over the next few weeks. Yeah, so that's, yeah, separate calls. Looks like we're going to do this as a wider community, not just patient summary. It is something that we've, we've had some previous conversations, but things have sort of moved along, and they're certainly, from an e-requesting perspective, they're a downstream profile or implementation guide from AU Core, so it's relevant to them as well, because we're effectively a downstream implementation guide from AU Core. So the same concerns or will be raised for them as well. So it's alternating
I ask
week.
for those of you who are on the call, who would be interested in, because this is almost a subgroup. This is a set of people who are interested to tackle the conformance content, to go away and work through a whole set of the conformance things and come back to this fortnightly call with a set of proposals around what obligations look like. Where does it actually work? Is this profile plus interaction? How can you declare, or where can you declare conformance? Can it be profile only? Can it be document only? How does it actually work? And bring that through. So can I understand, can you put your hand up in Zoom if you are interested, if that's more the kind of thing that you're interested in supporting through patient summary, is the conformance conversations? All right, we've got one. That's all right. Smaller groups mean quicker decisions. That's what that means. There's a couple of other people who I know have already approached me on this. So what we'll do, I think, is put out an optional set of invites. We'll make sure these are recorded, and they'll go right from Conformance 101, which we started in AU Core, and where that is around obligations. How does it work? How do you, when you pick up an IG and you want to say your product conforms to it, because we all expect that this is coming, right? There'll be some sort of national conformance requirements. How can you read an IG, know what the rules are, and also, more importantly, through the conversations we're going to have on the weekly thing, shape what those rules are that we embed in the IG? Is there a requirement for every single system to display, whether they're a HIE aggregator or not? Those sort of things is what we'll be working through. So we'll send out those invites. Right. We're about almost at time. In fact, no, we are at time. Apologies, we're over. So we'll rush through this. We've got a series of calls now up to the ballot. I'll recover this in the next meeting. Essentially, from now on, let's go through the profile walkthroughs along with some use case content. We'll try to get through as much of the profile walkthroughs and setting those while starting the conformance conversations up to the Spark testing event, because the goal is to have as much of an updated baseline as we can to have exposed through the testing opportunities that'll be on the 24th of June. So that's kind of the target there. I will remind people, though, if there's a topic you want to talk about, please raise that. This is a standing set of schedules, but the point of this is to support the community to implement patient summary. So if there's something you're trying to work through or something you want to raise for the group, just please either email the co-chairs, contact on Zulip, and let's start the conversation. That is always welcome and should always be prioritized. Next meeting, we're going to walk through patient immunization condition, and probably allergy intolerance, along with some of the use case stuff. What that means is we've got some homework. I'll email that round too. Can you please have a look at the profiles in the patient summary FHIR IG? Because what we really need are your questions, where if you read something, you're like, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand why this is a requirement, or I'm not really sure how to read this. There's some choices made in the IG that might be a bit like not obvious. Bring your challenges, those things we were talking about that we need to provide feedback back to IPS or AU Core, where we are looking for them to make a change so that we aren't inheriting it. And what you think we need to add in, what's missing. And you can always, especially if you can't attend, you can create a JIRA if you already know that you are going to propose something. Please do so. And if you can't attend the meeting, you can post it in Zulip, you can find a buddy to represent your views, you can create a JIRA, and we'll talk through and make sure that if we know that you have feedback on that, that we can at least show that in the meeting and talk through it as a group. All right, that comes to the end of that. Are there any other comments or questions or suggestions for additional agenda items for next meeting before we close? All right, thanks very much, everyone. I look forward to seeing you in a little over a fortnight, I think, where we're going to walk through the profiles and check where they're at and if we want to make any changes.
Great, thanks a lot, Danielle. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.